This is FRM Part 1, Book 1, Foundations of Risk Management. And this is Chapter 9. And remember what we've been doing for the previous 8 chapters. We've had a discussion on some good risk management principles and best practices. And then we looked at some failures, specific failures of individuals or firms who failed to apply those risk management principles. Now, this Chapter 9, called Risk Management Failures, is kind of a summary of all the stuff that we've been talking about, but it's also a description of what are indications of strategies or lack of strategies that are probably going to lead to failure. So let's look at the learning objectives here. Explain how large financial losses may not necessarily be evidence. Analyze and identify instances of risk management failure, and then explain how risk management failures in the following areas, measurements and identification and communication and monitoring, I'll talk about that in just a second here, and then take a look at some of the shortcomings of risk metrics. Let's start with the steps in the risk management process. And so if you look at this slide, there are 3 key steps. Now, I've been saying in every slide, are you ready for this? You know this. What's the goal of risk management? Identify the risks, quantify the risks, and then manage the risk. And what I have done it's kind of summarizing that strategy. That's pretty much summarized in the first box there. And I look at it on probably a micro level, thinking that the individual is responsible for managing his or her own portfolio or insurance policies or whatever it is, managing those kinds of risks. But the Global Association of Risk Professionals, they take, oh boy, they have the word global in there. So it's more of a macro idea about risk management. So my 3 things, identify, quantify, and measure, are kind of summarized in that first one. So look at that first step. Identifying and assessing the impact of all the risks. So we're going to identify the different kinds of risk: credit risk, operating risk, market risk, systematic risk, idiosyncratic risk, whatever those are. And then we're going to determine the expected loss and the unexpected loss. And the only way we can do that is if we have a good measure of risk. But then as the financial risk manager, it's our job then to communicate these to the decision makers. And those decision makers are probably the board and the CRO, so that those 2 people or groups of people then can make a much more defined and more accurate decision on which risk management strategies to pursue. And then, of course, in every academic or professional process, there's always a monitoring. And I've talked about this before. It's very, very helpful to look back and say, okay, this is what I thought, this is what I did, this is what actually happened, and how can I be better in the future? And so notice that third box, continuous monitoring. I mean, that doesn't mean really every second of every day, but continuous monitoring to make certain that the risk levels are not changing and that the strategy that has been implemented is appropriate in this dynamic economic environment. And notice the last part of that box there, to keep those risks within healthy limits. What does that mean? Healthy limits means that those are established limits under which the board or whoever's determining the risk appetite is comfortable. How about this question? Is a large financial loss necessarily evidence of a failure? Now, of course, if you're losing tons and tons of money and you're losing it every day, that's probably a systematic process that is evidence of a risk failure. But one large financial loss, it may or may not be, depending on the strategy from beginning to end. Let me go back here. If you, as a financial risk manager, perform these steps, this is not a guarantee that you're not going to sustain large losses. What it does is it enables you to better predict those losses, or at least manage those losses or mitigate those losses before they occur. Nevertheless, a large loss is not always indicative of a risk management failure. All right, so notice that first circle point there. As long as the firm assesses its risk and develops risk management policies that guide all of its operations. Think of that a couple of chapters ago. We had the picture of the big umbrella. Think of the big umbrella, all of its operations. The risk management function is considered effective. So top management then has to decide if it's willing or unwilling to take that risk. Let's take a look at an example. Let's suppose that we're a U.S. firm that owes a British bank a bunch of money, 10 million Great British pounds, payable in 6 months. All right. Note that both of these parties are subject to currency risk. What is the American firm exposed to? Well, there's the spot rate of exchange. Let's suppose that it's 1.2 US dollars per pound. Well, what do we know about spot rates? That thing is going to change. And so that number could go up. It could go to 1.3 or 1.4, in which case the US dollar depreciates, or it could fall to 1.1 or 1.0, in which the US dollar appreciates. And, don't feel constrained by those boundaries. I mean, it could go way up or it could go way down. Now, here's the thing. We know that 1.2 is going to change. So the question then becomes, are we willing to take the risk that exchange rate is going to move against us? And the answer is probably no, especially because currency forward contracts are really cheap. They're really easy. They're really simple. And there's really no reason not to enter one of these things to mitigate the risk. And of course, we could enter a contract for the full 10 million or partially hedge it with 8 million or 6 million or 4 million, whatever we think. I guess it depends on what our economists are telling us about the future exchange rate between the US dollar and the British pound. So let's suppose the terms of that contract are that that forward rate is 1.3 US dollars per British pound. So what this means is that the forward market is expecting the US dollar to depreciate 1.2 to 1.3. Now, we enter this contract today, and then we don't worry about it for 6 months. But let's suppose that 6 months later, that the spot rate is 1.1 US dollars per pound. All right, so the US dollar has strengthened, it has appreciated versus what the forward market and maybe what we thought was going to happen in terms of a depreciation. Now, the math here, we're going to end up spending $13 million to cover that accounts payable, or whatever kind of a payable it is. But had we not had the forward contract, we would have ended up spending just 11 million. Does this present evidence of a failure in risk management policy? And I would argue that the answer is no. I mean, I have another slide here explaining it. But remember, what did we do 6 months ago? We identified the risk, right? We said there's currency risk. We have measured the risk. So think of an Excel spreadsheet where we had all these different possible exchange rates. And then at the bottom of that spreadsheet, here are all of these possible future cash outflows to satisfy that obligation. And then we called a bank like Wells Fargo and said, hey, how much is it going to be for us to enter a forward contract? And the bank says, oh, it's just a small amount. And we say, boy, we don't really want to worry about the exchange rate moving way against us. Let's just lock in and we can focus on our core business. Maybe this American firm is a bakery and we bought something from Great Britain, corn or wheat, whatever it is, and we used it to bake so we can focus on our core business and we don't have to worry about currency risk. All right, so here's the solution to that question. Just because we lost 2 million doesn't mean that it's evidence of risk management failure. What it is signals, it is the willingness of the board of directors or whoever's determining the risk appetite. It's the cost of not being willing to bear that currency risk or that foreign exchange rate risk. And so here's the thing. The outcome is not the metric under which we measure our risk management policies. The entire policy is how we measure it. Now look in the bottom box there. I have a couple of really good sentences. The goal of risk management is not to reduce losses to zero. This is not what we want to do. I mean, if as individuals we wanted to completely eliminate risk, we would stay in bed all day long, every day. When we walk outside and drive in our car or get on a train or an airplane, we're taking some kinds of risk. But as I try to teach my children all the time, marginal costs and marginal benefits, weigh the two. And of course, that's got to be a part of measuring and evaluating the marginal cost of hedging in this example versus the marginal benefit of hedging. How about some important notes here? The decision to take known risks rests not with the risk manager, but with top management or with the board. The role of the risk manager, are you ready for this? Identify, evaluate, and communicate. Maybe I'll use those terms from now on because we're thinking of this in kind of the global sense. But the senior management will define risk appetite and risk tolerance, and then it's up to the risk managers to monitor those and manage those risks and evaluate the dynamics of this changing economic environment so that good financial risk managers can stay ahead of it. And just think of it this way. I love giving sports analogies. Think of the financial risk manager as the quarterback. He's out on the football field and he's doing all the stuff that he can to move his team down the field to score a touchdown or whatever. And so maybe it's a long third down or maybe it's fourth down. They call a timeout. He comes over to the coach and the coach says, okay, we're going for it on fourth down, or we're going to throw a pass, or we're going to punt. So it's the decision. The coach there is determining the risk appetite. It's up to the quarterback then to say, well, if we do that, then this or this or this could happen. And so the coach, the corporate leaders, the boards of directors, they decide on risk tolerance levels. How about some instances of risk management failures? So let's list some of these, and I have some slides. We can talk about them more specifically. We need to use appropriate risk metrics. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to say, okay, I'm going to measure the risk of my portfolio by going outside and counting the number of clouds in the sky. And if there are more than 10 clouds in the sky, I'm going to sell my equity portfolio and buy a fixed income portfolio. So we have to have the appropriate risk metrics, and we need to measure them correctly. We need to measure them using well-established ways to figure out levels of variability, like standard deviation or beta or value at risk. Oh my gosh, failure to communicate, failure to monitor, failure to recognize some risk. Boy, this is really a big one. First thing that I always say is identify the risks. That doesn't mean identifying the risks that are obvious to everybody. That means identifying the risks that are out there, the risks to which we are exposed. And that's the sign of a really good financial risk manager, is to be able to identify those risks that others may not find as obvious. How about failure to understand the correct distribution of returns? In the academic world, we're very, very tempted just to say, oh, stock returns follow a normal distribution. And sometimes they do, a lot of times they don't. Sometimes they follow what's known as a log normal distribution. But a lot of times that distribution is skewed one way or another. A lot of times there is kurtosis on one or both tails, so that we have some other kind of a distribution. And if you're evaluating and trying to measure the risk, assuming an incorrect distribution, well, then the decisions are going to be biased and probably ineffective. How about expanding this even further? Ignoring a risk that's well known, failure to properly incorporate risk into risk models, and then failure to unearth all risks that are facing the firm. How about the failure to use the appropriate risk metrics? Yeah, this is a big one here. So if the chosen risk metric is inappropriate or maybe just completely wrong, then the decision makers are going to be making those kinds of important decisions based on incorrect information. That's like the quarterback coming over and saying, okay, coach, let's go for it on fourth down. I think they're only going to put one person out there on defense. And the coach says, oh my gosh, if there's only going to be one person, we have 11, then we can surely get the first down. And then the player gets up there and there are 11 people and everyone's raising their hand. So good sports analogy there. Oh yes, we've got to be very careful when we apply this value at risk. So short-term value at risk measures can mislead management by suggesting low risk. Because let's face it, if you're a financial institution, what happens on a weekly basis? Nothing happens, then nothing happens, then nothing happens. You have some ranges. Interest rates might go up a little bit. Interest rates might go down a little bit. There might be changes in supply and demand in the mortgage market. There might be some small price changes in credit default swaps. But you might have this for 10 or 20 or 30 days, maybe even 50 days. And so if you keep evaluating over such a short term, you're tending to think that history is going to repeat itself. Until a huge event, a huge loss produces, insolvency or bankruptcy or some poor outcome. All right, what's the point of all this is that not only is it important to have the appropriate risk metric, but to put them in a long run context so that we can avoid this focus on short-termism. There's a good word that shows up in the financial press these days. Take a quick example here. We have a one-day value at risk of $10 million at the 1% probability level. So what does this mean? That means that the firm has a 1% chance, a small 1% chance of losing in excess of that $10 million. So here's what I was talking about in that previous slide. Let's suppose that it exceeds its value at risk only once in every 100 trading days, right? So we've got nothing. Now, every 100 days, it loses more than 10 million. But let's suppose on that one occasion, it loses $1 billion or $10 billion or some big number. Oh my gosh. So what happens about value at risk? Does it stand the test of time? And the answer is probably not. And this is a regular human failure because we're all subject to what's known as the confirmation bias. We're only really going to read stuff that confirms our thoughts. And so if yesterday was fine and the day before was fine, and the day before that was fine, it's probably going to be fine today. So look at that last bullet point there. Value at risk fails to capture low probability events with catastrophic effects. How about failure to measure risks correctly? Oh my gosh. So here's this discussion I had just a few moments ago about assuming an incorrect distribution of returns. Do we think it's normal? Do we think it's skewed? Do we think it's binomial? Do we think it's something else? Notice my first circle point there. If the wrong distribution is assumed, then the range of future outcomes and the frequency and magnitude of losses, not only will they be incorrect, but they will be misleading. And so notice the third part of my little thing, identify, quantify, and then manage. And so if we're managing those risks, the inputs are going to be misleading. How about if we fail to take known risks into account? Oh my gosh. So if we're just going to ignore something, then we're setting ourselves up for disaster. And this goes back several chapters ago. Remember I had that one slide where we had these little bins and I talked about corn bins or wheat bins and then the farmer making decisions. And then there's the umbrella over top of that. So remember that under the silo risk management model, it's easy to ignore or to not pay attention to or uncover the risks that are going on right next door in another part of the firm. How about a failure to communicate effectively? This is like the quarterback coming over and saying, all right, coach, it's pouring down rain. I think we're going to have a monsoon by the time we get off the next play. So if there's not good communication, then the coach and the determiners of risk appetite are going to make poor decisions. Let me read this to you. 10 years ago or so with this financial crisis. Here's a report published by UBS after losing billions of dollars. I think we talked about that in a previous slide. Are you ready? A number of attempts were made to present subprime or housing-related exposures. I don't know, what does that mean, a number of attempts? The reports did not, however, communicate an effective message for a number of reasons. In particular, because the reports were overly complex, presented outdated data, or were not made available to the right audience. So what does that sound like? That sounds like failures on a lot of different levels, but the not being made available to the right audience, that sounds like a failure to communicate. But also the outdated data, which may or may not depend on the current distribution of returns, and then having them be complex enough so that the risk appetite individuals or groups of individuals are not able to make that decision properly. All right, so going back to what I said just 15 minutes ago or so, we need to continuously monitor the risk. I have a colleague at school who talks about scanning the environment all the time. He talks about the end scan. And this is extremely important because what happens? We have dynamic economy, so the risk appetites and the risk preferences, they change, and they can change on a continual basis. And so we need to be updated all the time, updated. All right, risk metrics and their shortcomings. This is what we know. Value at risk is very widely used. Monitoring the value at risk allows managers to appropriately manage risk. So this is a good metric. I'm not telling you that it's a failure, even though there are some instances where it can lead to mismanagement. It's still a good risk management a good risk management tool. But it does not measure the worst case loss. And one of its assumptions is that the distribution of losses today are uncorrelated. In other words, that correlation coefficient is 0. They're uncorrelated with the distribution of losses yesterday or last week. And of course, what did we know and what did we learn in a previous chapter about the financial crisis that lasted from 2007 up until 2009 is that we had some losses, and that those losses then triggered other losses, maybe not the next day, but maybe the next week or the next month. But anyway, there's clearly not a 0 correlation between and among these returns. And then finally, depending on how you compute the value at risk, whether you use the historical method or whether you use some kind of a Monte Carlo simulation or other kinds of algorithms that are relatively easy to program, you're going to get different results. And so historical VAR might be like this, and the Monte Carlo might be like this. And so that's a difficult decision. What you've got to do then is go back and figure out which underlying method is more appropriate for the current environment. And that takes us through this chapter 9. Boy, we explained large financial loss might not be evidence of failure. We talked about instances. We did the measuring and the identifying, and we talked about risk metrics. So that sounds like we covered all those learning objectives in this reading. Next up, we're going to get our calculators out and do some math with one of my favorite models of all time, capital asset pricing model.